that much of the southern landscape was grassland, but always close by, somewhere, were forests and woodlands in close proximity to one another. And that's what really makes southern grasslands so special. I try to poll most of the audiences that I speak to, and I usually ask them to raise their hand to see how many of you people have been taught this myth. We call the myth of the squirrel. And for me, the myth of the squirrel was taught to me by my sixth grade Tennessee history teacher in 1990, a guy named Tommy Johns. And I remember it like this. He said that at the time the first Europeans came to the eastern shores of America, that the continent was clothed in dense forests so vast that a squirrel could travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River without touching the ground. And that's what I believed all the way up through high school and probably even into early college years, was that I was walking around and all the open spaces I was seeing day to day were artificial landscapes because they used to be dense forests. You can imagine scenes like this from the turn of the 20th century, from the Great Smoky Mountains, show giant chestnut trees and tulip poplars that are 8 to 10 feet in diameter. It's easy to visualize how some industrious squirrel could just hop right along that way from tree to tree, all the way across. One thing that my teacher, Tommy Johns, never talked about, however, was he never talked about grasslands. We didn't have sod houses in Tennessee. We didn't have the Sioux Nation, the Mandan tribe. We didn't talk about buffalo getting driven over a cliff in the Great Plains, because Tennessee has long been thought to be an entirely forested state. So I suppose if I had been going to school in Kansas or Nebraska, grasslands would have been on my middle school curriculum, but not for me. I wish that I would have learned beautiful quotes like the one I'll read to you real quick. It says, "It would be difficult to imagine anything more beautiful. For as far as the eye could reach, they seemed one vast, deep green meadow, adorned with countless numbers of bright flowers springing up in all directions. Only a few clumps of trees and now and then a solitary post oak were to be seen. It was here I first saw the prairie bird, or the barren hen as we called it, which I afterwards met with in such vast numbers on the great prairies of Illinois. Here the wild strawberries grew in such profusion as to stain the horses' hooves a deep red color." Reuben Ross, 1812. You see, Reuben Ross lived in the area, the border region of what is now Tennessee and Kentucky, just north of Clarksville. And he was a circuit preacher, much like I am today. I'm making the circuit and preaching prairie, except he was preaching the gospel. And he covered the area of Southern Todd and Christian counties and adjacent parts of Tennessee. And along his travels, soon after he moved to that area, he documented seeing this barren hen, which we now know of as the greater prairie chicken. John James Audubon had also documented the prairie chicken from Kentucky as well, a little bit earlier. But today, that species is totally exterminated from Kentucky, and the last time anybody ever wrote about it was Reuben Ross over 200 years ago. The prairie that he was describing, these open, beautiful, treeless plains, is what we would call the Pennyroyal Plain Prairie, or also known as the Big Barrens. And it's a vast landscape. Most of the flat to rolling lands that you see around Mammoth Cave and Elizabethtown, these are part of that former prairie landscape. And some people in the past have considered that to be an outlier of the Great Plains, which is farther to the west, and others do not consider that region to be an outlier of the Great Plains. But regardless, we had grassland here, and it supported endemic animal species like the greater prairie chicken. So when I went off to college in the early 2000s, I began to get trained as an ecologist, as a botanist, and this was the most recent map as of 1993 of where the grasslands in the South were located. You can see here that those big barrens of Kentucky are clearly shown, of the Pennyroyal Plain. You can also see a big patch of grasslands out in far western Kentucky, and I'll come back and talk about it in a little while, called the Jackson Purchase Prairie. But there's big prairies mapped for Alabama and Mississippi, and down in coastal Louisiana and Texas, down in Florida, and a little bit in eastern Arkansas. Otherwise, you see these asterisks, which basically indicate small grassland patches that he didn't quite know, they didn't quite know how to characterize those. Fast forward about another 10 years, or actually longer than that, in 2013, about 20 years later, this map was produced by two organizations that World Wildlife Fund and NatureServe attempted to map the grasslands in North America. In doing so, you can see that they have detailed maps of where the Great Plains were. They mapped the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands of Texas and northern Mexico, and the California grasslands and other kinds of western grasslands. But when it comes to those in the Southeast, like within the green outlined area, which is SGI's focal region, you see they only included some grasslands along that western border and part of the coastal prairie of Texas and Louisiana. Where are those same polygons, those black areas that were mapped by DeSelm and Murdoch earlier from Kentucky and Mississippi and Florida? Those are big grasslands, each of them over 1 million acres in some cases. Why are they not shown as part of North America's grasslands? So in the same year that NatureServe and World Wildlife Fund produced that map, coincidentally, one of the most important ecological books about grasslands in North America was also published. And it came out, it's a book called Forgotten Grasslands of the South by Dr. Reed Noss. And in that book, there are really three fundamental things that I take away from it. Number one is that in the Southeastern U.S., that area that's bordered there in green, there are more types of grassland habitats than in all of the Great Plains of the U.S. and Canada combined. So in that area, there's more than what you would find in the yellow zone immediately to the west. Secondly, there are more species that are dependent upon grasslands in the Southeast than in the entire Great Plains, the U.S. and Canada combined. And thirdly, and I think this is really important, is that the southern grasslands they exhibit a high degree of antiquity, suggesting that they've been here for a very long period of time. In fact, Reed Noss reviews the fossil record and the ecological record and shows that several types of southern grasslands have been here at least for millions of years. So they are not necessarily a recent phenomenon. They've been here for a long time. So today, my colleagues with SGI and our science advisory team are beginning to revise the maps of the southern landscape. And part of this includes trying to map where our grasslands were. We believe that, and this number actually has changed, that there were not just over 100 million acres, but there were more than 120 million acres of grasslands in the Southeastern U.S. at the time of European settlement. Now, what I want to be clear about is that we're not suggesting that all of eastern North Carolina was a prairie. What we are suggesting, though, is that the majority of that landscape would have been classified, if you were to look at it in 1700, as one of the types of grasslands that I'm about to show you. And there certainly would have been forest in the region, and there would have been various types of wetlands, but the main type of community in these regions shown in yellowish brown were grassland habitats. So let's see what we mean by grassland. We're talking about basically one of about 10 major kinds of community types. These include coastal dune grasslands, like you might see on the coast of Florida. But within the eastern interior regions, like in Kentucky and Tennessee, you would see these kinds of grasslands. You would have big open prairies, like you'd see at Fort Campbell Army Base, for example. Savannas were grasslands with scattered trees. And so savannas probably covered more than any other kind of grassland in the South. They actually had trees in them. They accounted for 100 million acres alone. Grass balds are found in the high elevations of the Blue Ridge Mountains, places like Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Roan Mountain. In several places, we have rocky, almost desert-like grasslands we call glades and barrens. There are various kinds of open wetlands, fens, meadows, bogs, marshes. And in places like the Rockcastle River in southeast Kentucky or the Big South Fork National River, are flood-maintained grasslands that are found in the bottoms of river canyons. I was actually on some of those yesterday and nearly broke 3 bones. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't have to get airlifted out. I almost smacked my head on a rock last night trying to get out of a river canyon. So fortunately that didn't happen. I'm here with you. So the prairie preacher gets to do a little bit more preaching. Now I want you to notice that the foreword of Reed Noss's book was written by the preeminent ecologist, Dr. E.O. Wilson, who happens to also be from Alabama. And what he writes in his, in that foreword, he says, he titles the Southern Grasslands as, he coins a new term and says they are part of the Southern Grassland Biome. He says the Southern Grassland Biome, when it's properly defined to include the longleaf pine savanna and its intermittent hardwood bottomlands, is probably the richest terrestrial biome in all of North America. To understand, cherish, and preserve the great natural heritage of the Southern Grassland Biome should be a priority goal in America's environmental movement. We would agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Wilson about that, but we would also argue that up until now, grasslands have been out of sight, out of mind, and have been far below other kinds of natural communities when it comes to conservation priorities. I'll revisit that in a while. So let's talk about what are the contributions of grasslands to our biodiversity and wildlife. Well, the 2 biggest types of grasslands in terms of acreage that they covered are the savannas on the right and the prairies on the left. These savannas on the right, you might say, well, why wouldn't you call that a forest or maybe a woodland? Well, you could, but we would call it a grassland for the following reasons. There's one species of tree on that landscape, in this case, longleaf pine. However, if you look at a single square meter, an area just a little bit bigger than my outstretched arms, you have 52 species of plants packed into a single square meter. These are not forest dependent species. These are not the kind of species that hang out with ginseng and Virginia bluebells and trilliums. Those species need shade. These species, on the other hand, need high sunlight, open conditions that only a grassland type of community can provide. So you could literally take out every longleaf pine in this scene, and these species would still be as happy as they can be with, as long as they got full sun and as long as they maintain the conditions on the ground that they need. We would call these conservative plants, and we would call them heliophytes, meaning sun lovers. Kentucky has a lot of conservative heliophytes as well. But the other kind of grassland, those shown on the left, these big prairies, this happens to be the biggest open prairie left in eastern North America. This is in Florida, just south of Orlando at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve. And this is a 55,000 acre open prairie that stretches across parts of Avon Park Air Force Base. It even has an endemic bird. The Florida grasshopper sparrow is known from here and nowhere else. When we start thinking about contributions of grasslands to biodiversity, we need to think first at that community level scale, right? There are 1,213 rare plant communities or habitat types in the Southeast. Half of those are grasslands, and you can see some of those on your left here. When you have a single power line prairie like we do in Starkville, Mississippi, that's 50 acres in size, there are 90 species of bees that have been documented in a 50 acre prairie patch. Think about that, 90 species of bees. Now think about how many grasshoppers there are, how many katydids, how many leafhoppers, and all the other kinds of insects. And all of a sudden, you're in the thousands of species that a given prairie can support. Those insect species are vitally important for bats that are insectivorous or insectivorous birds, which are themselves important for other kinds of wildlife like bobcats and turkeys and you name it. Obviously, many of these either feed on insects or they feed on the seeds that prairie plants provide. So ultimately, we're talking about that prairies supply groceries. These are the groceries on the ground. Whether we're talking about bees or bob white, they're vitally important to sustaining higher levels of biodiversity. We've run some numbers in Tennessee. We looked at our rare terrestrial animals. 34% of them need grassland habitats. These include things like pine snakes and Henslow's sparrows and meadow jumping mouse. In terms of the rare plants of Tennessee, and I haven't run these numbers yet for Kentucky, but I have for states like Maryland, where the numbers also are 60%. 60% of our rare plants in Tennessee need grassland habitats. The royal catchfly shown here from Hart County, Kentucky is a great example of one of those rare species for Kentucky. Now, a lot of our grasslands were not the large prairies and savannas that covered tens of thousands or millions of acres. Many of them are small kinds of grasslands like glades and barrens, but they're also the kinds of things that make southern grasslands very special. So the fact that many grasslands were naturally small, unlike the Great Plains, which were huge, actually helps contribute to their importance to biodiversity. And so the area shown here in red also happens to be a hotspot for biodiversity. Recently, our colleagues out of Mississippi have described 21 new species of grasshoppers from different grassland types in the Southeast, and they continue to yield new species all the time. Just a few years ago, a beautiful species of blue burrowing crayfish was named from just east of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, this is not a stream dwelling species. This one lives in wet meadows in the area just east of Chattanooga. And there's new research that's suggesting that there might even be a new species of mammal, a type of deer mouse that's found in those high elevation mountaintop grass balls on Roan Mountain, Tennessee and Kentucky, and Tennessee and North Carolina. Further genetic research is needed to confirm this, but initial suspicion suggests it's new to science. So part of Kentucky and Tennessee and the rest of the Southeast is now, as of 2015, has been designated as the world's newest global biodiversity hotspot. This is now accepted by the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, as well as Conservation International. So that begins to really put the Southeast on sort of an equal footing with many of these other incredibly important regions around the world with outstanding levels of biodiversity. And our grassland biodiversity is a major driver behind that hotspot designation, as is our aquatic diversity with fishes and mussels, and certainly forest diversity is high as well. Let's go back to Reed Noss's title of his book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South, and ask ourselves, why do we call them forgotten to begin with? And this is really an important point. We call them forgotten because look at this painting here. This could be Kansas, it could be Nebraska, but it's not. This is a reconstruction of what Montgomery, Alabama looked like in 1775. The only way we know that is that oil painter Philip Juris, who is a good friend of mine from Athens, Georgia, also is a historian of sorts. And so he goes back and takes old journal entries from the first settlers and explorers who described the southern landscape in the 1700s. And he went back out to the site where naturalist William Bartram described this vast open prairie in 1775. And today it's within the city limits of Montgomery, Alabama. But he went back out there and recreated this scene of what that area looked like then using his amazing art skills. The reason that we don't know about a lot of our southern grasslands, though, are these. There's three. One is that most of them were gone before the camera was invented. Most of them were gone before they could be painted or sketched. And most of them were gone before the first educated naturalists were even able to visit them and write about them. And this certainly applies in many areas of Kentucky and as well as Tennessee and other parts of the South. If we begin to look at this quote from William Foote from the area around Charlotte, North Carolina, we get a really great firsthand account as to just how early some of these grasslands disappeared and why we don't know about them today. It says previous to the year 1750. Now let that sink in. That's 26 years before our nation was founded. Previous to the year 1750, the solitary cabins were found upon the borders of prairies and in the vicinity of canebrakes. The immense ranges were abounding in wild game, affording sustenance the whole year for herds of tame cattle. Extensive tracts of land between the Yadkin and the Catawba rivers, now waving with thrifty forests, then were covered with tall grass with scarcely a bush or a shrub, the abundant grass luxuriating in its native wildness and beauty. What's significant about that is by the year 1750, Those big grasslands of central North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia had already transitioned into forested landscapes as a result of the loss of natural fire on the landscape and Native American fire as well. So we at SGI are really very interested in where and how we know where grasslands were. We have to know where they were so we can know how to restore them and how to study them. This map from 1720 shows savannas in northern Florida, and here's those savannas that William Foote was describing from the Carolinas there. Other terms like all level and good ground is code for grassland. And then of course right here over what is Tennessee and Kentucky, savanna land and good pasture ground. This little squiggly line here is the Cumberland River, and it was at such an early point in American cartography that the French had not even fully explored the Cumberland River yet. So they just said, draw a little squiggly line here. Whereas other rivers like the Tennessee, farther south, had been very well explored by this point. And the Native Americans who lived along that river, the various villages, the islands, all of these had already been mapped out. But large sections of this area were considered to be grasslands even at this early date. We can also look to museum specimen records to understand where grasslands were. So for Tennessee, we could go in and map the occurrences of blackjack oak trees and egret sunflower, meadow jumping mouse populations, Henslow sparrows, and certain types of burrowing crayfish or butterflies. And we can map those, and we know with a high fidelity that those were grasslands because these species cannot occur in large part outside of grassland habitats. We need to do this for Kentucky, and I know there's interest among some of my colleagues at Kentucky Nature Preserves. My friend Julian Campbell, who some of you may know, has done some of this as well. Of course, one of the best ways to know about grasslands is to find the actual remnants. Looking in power line corridors, looking on rural roadside banks, and sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find those grasslands are still hanging on in various places. Computer modeling can also help. This is an effort where they took about 25 different landscape parameters like degree of slope and soil type and geology type. And they were able to predict areas that would be grasslands. And here you can see in southern Kentucky, the Pennyroyal Plain shown here in beige is predicted as an open prairie. Here's the area around Elizabethtown right up here, also predicted as prairie. But some of these are only as good as the data that you put into them. So for example, the area here north and west of Mammoth Cave in the edge of the Shawnee Hills is mapped as a really dense forest. However, we suspect that area was actually mostly open savanna to open woodland, given the high degree of remnant grasslands that are found in that region. So that suggests these maps may need to be tweaked a little bit. So the lesson then is that the Southeast was not the Great Plains. We didn't have extensive continuous grasslands that covered millions and millions of acres in some cases. Many of our grasslands were small scale and patch-like and occurred close to forest and forested wetlands and other kinds of habitats. So they were definitely more of a mosaic. So what happened to all the grasslands of the South? Where did they go? Well, if we take a look, about 100 million acres looked like the scene on the right. They were savannas with treed grasslands. These areas really depended on fire to keep them open. And let's take a look and see what happens when they don't have fire. Keep a close watch on this. That's the same scene going in reverse, right? So this scene since has been opened up, but in the past 100 years, it's mostly existed as a closed canopy forest because we took fire out of that landscape. Now let's take a look at places like what the bluegrass of Kentucky would have looked like historically. Probably at the time when Daniel Boone would have observed it from the top of Pilot Knob, it would have looked something like this, with huge herds of bison documented as well. But those areas subsequently became overgrazed and then later were replenished with cool season grasses like the bluegrass that we think of today, Poa pratensis, and other grasses like fescue. What the original bluegrass is, we really don't know. It was probably some native species that is not the common European species that we see today. The same thing has happened in Tennessee. We have our own version of the bluegrass called the Nashville Basin, which is very, very analogous. The third situation is what you could see in westernmost Kentucky or around Bowling Green. In this case, these beautiful lush prairies with deep soil were very fertile. These became the cornfields and the soybean fields of most of central and western Kentucky. So through the course of time, since European settlement, I didn't hear this story from Tommy Johns, right? So I had to learn it on my own. But we've had this, what we call shifting baselines. If you were on a wagon in Western Virginia in 1730, you would have known about these grasslands. You would be traveling through them. You would hear your grandparents speaking about the barrens. The same thing is true if you were living in Middle Tennessee right prior to the Civil War. You probably would hear about the barrens being mentioned as a place or from your grandparents. After we've lost them to overgrazing, being replaced with cool season grasses like fescue and bluegrass, and after converting to forest as a result of fire suppression or being converted to croplands, they simply vanished from from society's collective memory. And so what we begin to see then is this has happened in waves. If we look, those in the east disappeared by 1750. Those a little bit farther west by 1800. Those of Kentucky were largely gone by the Civil War, and so forth, all the way out until we get into parts of the western areas of our range. Let's take a look at some of these grasslands, and we look at them in sort of 5 states of conservation. Now, 2 of these 5 don't really apply to Kentucky, and I'll just mention these really quickly. There's one group that is still relatively intact, but they're being rapidly lost. And those occur out in like Texas and Oklahoma, where there's still some prairie left that's being rapidly lost. The second type that I won't speak about are those in South Florida. And they're actually doing pretty good today, but they're going to be eliminated within 100 years due to rising sea levels based on current predictions. So those are okay, but they're liable to be completely extinct. And most scientists now in that region are completely writing them off as not being worth our attention anymore, because they are so assuredly, based on model predictions, going to be lost to sea level rise. So what are the 3 types that Kentucky has that we need to talk about? Well, number 1, there are what we call functionally extinct grasslands. And this includes places like the Pennyroyal Plain. And we're going to use an example here from eastern Arkansas to kind of set the stage. If you were to go back and look at maps from around 1800, what you'd see is that these areas of the Grand Prairie of eastern Arkansas between Little Rock and Memphis supported over multiple county regions, supported about 500,000 acres of prairie. This is the area shaded sort of in dark red here. But today, all that's left are these little bright red patches. These are the remnants that have survived after 200 years of time. That's it. So how much acreage is that? Down from 500,000 in, say, 1810. In 2017, it went to 450 acres. That's it. But from 2017 to 2018, it dropped from 450 down to 375 acres. So we're really, I mean, how do we even call that a functioning ecosystem? And I would say we probably cannot. So you see this, this long line here, these 2 lines. In fact, how does that, what does that look like on the ground? Well, that line is this line, this long, slender prairie remnant that is sandwiched between a highway and an abandoned railroad. That's what that line is. That's it. If you were driving on the road, would you even recognize that as a prairie? Can we call it a prairie? Well, it's home to 440 native prairie species still, even though it's only about 50 feet wide. Now, one of these other areas that you see farther to the south, about 10 miles south of this right-of-way, my colleague and co-founder Theo Witzel was walking through one of these prairies, and he stepped on a rock until he realized that there are no rocks in this part of Arkansas. And he went back and retraced his steps, and he picked up what happened to be a species we call an ornate box turtle, which is a prairie-dependent box turtle that had not been seen in that region since 1983. So anyways, he didn't have a camera, so he went back to Little Rock, took the turtle with him all the way back, an hour's drive back to Little Rock, got his camera, brought the turtle and camera back to the prairie, took its picture, as you can see right there, and then sat it down. And then published a paper saying, hey, we've rediscovered the ornate box turtle here in Kentucky, in Arkansas. We're thinking about writing a children's book called Rocky the Turtle Goes to Little Rock, and to really highlight just how rare these prairies have become now. Because imagine if you're in one of these little remnants, if you're an ornate box turtle, how will you get to the next prairie that may be 5 or 10 miles away? So Kentucky has its own functionally extinct grasslands, and these include the Pennyroyal Plain. Historically, it was 3.7 million acres, but today we're down to probably less than 30,000 acres. And that sounds like a lot until you realize that about 25,000 of those acres are located exclusively at Fort Campbell Army Base, and most of them are off limits. So it highlights how important the military is, in this case, in protecting some of those last remaining grasslands. And you can see one of these big prairies at Fort Campbell right here in this scene. Here's another shot. This is from the Kentucky side of Fort Campbell, what they call the impact zone, where the the ordinances that they fire are really important to setting fires and keeping that prairie thriving. If Fort Campbell didn't exist, that entire area, I assure you, would be under corn or soybeans to this day. There's another kind of prairie that's functionally extinct, and it also historically was over 1 million acres in size, and it barely enters Kentucky down south of Lake Cumberland in parts of Clinton County and Russell County and probably into Pulaski County. Hazeldale Meadow is home to one of these remnants where you guys get the dwarf sundew. And these photos on the left are from some Tennessee examples of this, what we call the Eastern Highland Rim Prairie and Savanna. Out in westernmost Kentucky, the Jackson Purchase supported about 400,000 acres of prairie up until around the 1830s, 1840s. And today we know of probably less than 15 to 20 acres collectively across multiple sites. Most of them are just tiny roadside remnants. There's really nothing left of those prairies except for that. Even the bluegrass had a ring of sort of prairie and savanna around the outer bluegrass. The inner bluegrass is largely thought to have been more of a forest and wooded system. But that's one of the things that attracted Daniel Boone and attracted the Iroquois nation before him. They claimed that as their lands, called the Great Meadows. So those prairies are largely under agricultural production today. Let's talk about what we would think of as restorable grasslands, is the second type. These are areas where we would often see oak hickory forest or maybe oak pine forest. Oftentimes these would be sort of dry landscapes. We would see these especially in parts of the Highland Rim of Kentucky and the Shawnee Hills, maybe also over on the Cumberland Plateau. And in this landscape, most of the biodiversity is not even in the forest, but it's actually in power line rights of way. That's where the rare species congregate. And in Tennessee, just by accident, we have come to understand the importance of selectively harvesting the trees out of this land, as has been done here. You can see this exact stand has been opened up. I'll show it to you one more time. And in doing so, they took this landscape from having 30 species of herbs and grasses on the ground to more than 330 species on the ground. And not just the return of things like ragweed, right? We're talking about the return of species that are really uncommon, in many cases rare. So after this was thinned out by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, it was also burned repeatedly over the span of 20 years. And now it is back to a savanna condition like it would have been based on historical records from 100 years ago. And now what we're seeing is the return of conservative species. Very likely they're returning from the seed bank, not blowing in on the wind, because there's nowhere really for them to blow in from. So anecdotal evidence is now suggesting that these species have been there the whole time, almost like buried treasure underneath the ground, either as seeds or as living rootstocks, ready and waiting to reemerge when the canopy opens and conditions come back. But ladies and gentlemen, what we're afraid of is that this buried treasure, we may lose the treasure map if we don't start opening up, and this is a controversial topic, but we have overwhelming growing evidence to suggest many of the places that are forested around the South today were in fact historically savannas. And the worst thing we can do for those areas is to continue to maintain them in a closed canopy state. Now, please understand me. The Southeastern Grasslands Initiative loves forests, but we want to ensure that forests occur where forests are supposed to be, and that grasslands, including savannas and open grassy woodlands, occur where they're supposed to be. And so much of our forested landscape today are in areas that really should be much more open, either as savannas or open grassy woodlands. So where in Kentucky should we look at to concentrate these kinds of initiatives? Certainly in the southernmost regions of the Cumberland Plateau of Kentucky, parts of the Daniel Boone National Forest, McCreary County and Whitley County are great examples. There's also embedded bog habitats within these upland savannas that are now suffering because they too are becoming closed in. These will be improved and can be restored by restoring that upland savanna that surrounds them. The Mammoth Cave Hills, the edge of the Shawnee Hills there, I would say a large part of Mammoth Cave National Park is overwhelmingly too densely forested. And the signatures are there on the landscape with all the remnants and historical data to suggest that a good portion of Mammoth Cave should be much more open than it is today. We can look in power line corridors like in northern Todd County and see purple milkweed. And again, these remnant grasslands are all around us. And a very contentious area is northern land between the lakes, the Kentucky portion. That portion which occurs along the trace, that main dividing ridge in the north portion of LBL, all the signatures are there that should be an oak savanna, an open oak grassy woodland, not a closed canopy forest. The last category I'm going to mention to you that pertains to Kentucky are relatively secure grasslands. And in this case, there's really only one type that I can point you to that are still doing pretty well. And these include the river scour barrens found along portions of the Rockcastle River and the Big South Fork River. These are old growth grasslands that are literally tens of thousands of years old. Here you can see one of my grad students is posing beside a nearly flattened old growth red cedar that it's easily could be 400 to 500 years old there. This area is home to many endemic species, including about 6 species that are new to science that don't even yet have a name. They're found only in these riparian flood-scoured grasslands. There's other kinds of barrens that you'll find around the state that are also hard. They're still around because they're hard to develop on. Places like Mantle Rock out near Paducah comes to mind as a type of sandstone glade grassland. And more types of sandstone glades and limestone glades in various parts of the state. So, you know, we're down now to the last fragments of our native grasslands in Kentucky. You might call them the last 1%. In many areas of Kentucky, we've lost the ability to do what we could have done 100 years ago with appropriate either philanthropic or corporate or government investment. Let's go back and look at this historical scene right here on the left. This is a newspaper article from 1904 advertising 10,000 acres of virgin prairie for sale in the Grand Prairie, right that same region where Rocky the Turtle got stepped on. We missed that opportunity. You can't now, there's no way for a billionaire philanthropist to come in and buy that, right? Because today it's in rice fields and cornfields. Nothing remains in major part of this system, except for little fragments like the one on the right. In fact, this square, what we call postage stamp prairie that you see on the right, is exactly where Rocky got stepped on. So what do we do when the last 1% of our landscape, our grassland landscape, is clinging to life? Well, what do the dickcissels do? What do the greater prairie chickens do? What do all the species that need those grasslands do? They disappear because they don't have what they need. Well, we lost prairie chickens and bison from Kentucky 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, due to overhunting. But now it's all these species that are beginning to disappear rapidly because they don't have what they need. And just within the past 20 years, 25 years, we've seen bobwhite quail now being almost unhuntable because its numbers are so low, or in many areas across Kentucky, it's dropped out completely. Monarch butterfly numbers are often faltering and failing. Bee populations are dropping. So it's because of grassland birds and grassland pollinators, especially, that many are beginning to say, hey, you know what? There's a problem. These are the canaries in the coal mine that are signifying to us that there's a major problem in our landscape, that we're mismanaging it and misunderstanding it. And I would come back and say that the reason for that is we've been taught this myth of the squirrel now for over 100 years, to believe that the entire Eastern U.S. should be forested, not giving equal due and diligence to the understanding that major parts of the Southeast should be grasslands. So if we want to ever get back to having some large scale grasslands, and look, we don't want to do this for the sake of just doing it. We have to recreate grasslands and restore and preserve grasslands, because if we don't, think of all the high amounts of biodiversity that are tied to them, which are going to disappear. So if we want landscapes like you see on the left again, we have to go out and search for those remnant prairies in Hart County, Kentucky, in Grayson County, in Todd and Logan counties. We have to find them. We have to figure out first, how do we prevent them from being destroyed in a good way by working with private landowners? How do we collect seeds from them and get those seeds in production so that we can have something to restore from? And that's really part of why SGI is so committed to this effort. So, you know, I think we can all look back and see a lot of great successes with forest conservation, wetland conservation, and river conservation. But can we look back and honestly say we've done a good job with grassland conservation in Kentucky or Tennessee? That's a good question. Well, I think the numbers speak for themselves. When bobwhite is absolutely dropping like a rock and pollinators are dropping like a rock, we're not doing something right. And so part of our mantra now is that SGI is on a mission to chart a new course for conservation in the 21st century. Because whatever we've been doing for the past century is not working for these two major important groups. And they signify we're not doing something right for half of our landscape. So I'd like to ask you guys, can our grasslands survive into the next century? We don't believe, unless there's a coordinated effort to conserve and research and rebuild them, we don't believe they will in major part. This is the large impetus behind why we created SGI to begin with. But going forth into 2021, we have still major challenges ahead. There are major knowledge gaps. This is where we thought grasslands were just 20 years ago. Here's where we think they were actually, based on today's research. They're extremely rare. How do you protect something and rebuild from a roadside prairie remnant? They have a scarcity of funding. Think of all the money that is held by major corporations, major philanthropists, government funding that is not going toward the highest priorities in conservation right now in Eastern North America are Southeastern grassland communities. And we're not seeing a dime in major part from some of those resources. There are diminished resources, physical resources, declining expertise. Fewer universities are training the next generations of botanists and ecologists and conservation workers. And there's an untapped workforce, a major untapped workforce of volunteers who want to give their time to help solve some of these critical problems. However we do it, we have to have a multifaceted response, and it's got to be urgent. So we created the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative in 2017 to step up to the table because we saw that there was a void in thinking and prioritizing grasslands specifically. I want to be clear that there's a lot of great organizations doing great work at a local or regional scale. But at a sort of sub-national scale, there really was nothing focused solely on grasslands, and that's why SGI was created. We have 8 strategies, conservation strategies that include things like seed banking, education, rescuing rare plants, recreation, restoration. And then we're guided by 4 programmatic priorities. And let me go through these real quick with you. Number 1, I can't do any of this obviously alone, and I hope you guys know that SGI is not Dwayne Estes. I know I'm on Facebook a lot, and I'm sort of the face of the organization, but I want everybody to be well aware that we have been assembling a team that is doing great work. And I'm really proud of this team. This is only part of them. I can't fit them all on the same screen. But I also want to give a shout out to my co-founder here, Theo Witzel, who's in Little Rock, Arkansas. And part of this team includes people that at the university, at Austin Peay State University, but also people who are remotely stationed around the Southeast. So we also have been building a private lands team that is working across Tennessee and Kentucky. Brittany Vyers is our regional ecologist, coordinating biologist, who is overseeing some of our great work that we're doing with Quail Forever and USDA NRCS and American Bird Conservancy. So Brittany is based in Clarksville, but she also supervises Megan Hart, who is trained as an ornithologist from Austin Peay, and she covers Kentucky and works with private landowners. In Tennessee, her equivalent is Jeremy French. And I know Jeremy recently has spoken to the Middle Tennessee chapter of Wild Ones. And just recently, we received funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation with Quail Forever to hire a new forester who will work on the Cumberland Plateau. We're really excited by that. We now have a position who is focused solely on rare plant conservation. Cooper Breeden coordinates our Tennessee Plant Conservation Alliance, works closely with Tara Littlefield of Kentucky State Nature Preserves. He's based in Nashville. And then we have someone who basically manages all of our collections and our museum that has herbarium specimens. That's Mason Brock. He's actually a native of Kentucky from the Bluegrass region and is really an exceptionally talented young botanist. Thanks to some private philanthropic dollars and some government dollars, from the National Park Service particularly, we've been able to hire a new Southern Appalachian coordinator, Zach Irick, who's based in Chattanooga, and he covers the mountains regions of Eastern Kentucky. So if anybody there is interested in that work. And we're beginning to station new positions in North Carolina, Athens, Georgia, and hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to Little Rock, Arkansas. But to our priorities, first and foremost is education and outreach. We want to envision a time where we, hopefully once we get past 2020 and past this COVID pandemic, we want to envision a time where this is the way we will make our impact, by creating outdoor community centers where young and old alike and people from diverse backgrounds can come together and experience nature and do some great work in conservation. That could be seed collection, seed cleaning. It could be taking workshops, touring natural areas, learning how to restore prairies on the ground. We want to do that through education as our first priority. We've been inspired in particular by some activities in Chicago that now have a 50-year history of doing great work at restoring prairies. You can see just some images here, the sense of having a place where people can gather. It doesn't have to be a physical building, it could be an outdoor space. But they really are showing that this community-led conservation is the way of the future. And I've written a blog about this you can find on our SGI blog site called Bringing Chicago-Style Conservation to the South. And let me just briefly kind of highlight as a way to showcase this priority of ours, why we feel that the Chicago method is so important. Number one, it's bringing people together. Number two, this is the way that most southern grasslands have been restored, at least say in the past 10 to 20 years. Most people would simply plant a field of native warm season grasses, big blue stem and Indian grass, and walk away and say, hey, I've got a restored prairie. But in Chicago, they're going one major step forward. They're not just putting in a couple of prairie grasses, right? They are rebuilding natural landscapes to the highest degree that we know how to do. And this is done in part through the study of natural remnants. So how do they do this? They do it with the people, and they do it with such a high degree of precision that species like the Baltimore checker spot and Henslow sparrows are able to actually come back, and not only come back, but are on the upswing in the greater Chicago region, in large part because of the great amount of grassland work they're doing. So this can happen either in a rural context or it can happen in an urban landscape. And let me just show you, like right here in the heart of urban Chicago, where you have all these houses, looking across that tree line in the distance, is a scene that few can imagine. In that area called Somme Prairie Grove is an area where they have cleared out the underbrush that has invaded that area over the past 100 years with buckthorn and privet. And now, using the seed their volunteers have collected from prairie remnants, they've been able to restore this very grand prairie. So all this has been brought back using seeds collected from remnant grasslands in the region. So they've also been able to scale this up. They can do this at 50 acres. They've also been able to scale this up a couple hours outside Chicago at the Nachusa Prairie to 3,500 acres. And they've got their eyes set on expanding that to a 10,000 acre prairie. Can you guys imagine if we were to be able to rebuild a 10,000 acre prairie, or even a 1,000 acre prairie outside of Bowling Green? That's what part of what SGI wants to accomplish. In our next 10 years, we want to see a big area of prairie restored. And my very last slide, and I know I'm getting probably long-winded, but my very last slide is going to touch on what I hope will be the nucleus of that growing prairie constellation. But I hope we will create a nucleus of new prairie in Southern Kentucky, and we can do it based on the Chicago model. So I'm inspired by what they're doing there. And again, the way they accomplished it is through volunteers, empowered volunteers, scaling this up now over 3,000 acres. There's buffalo roaming over 1,500 of those 3,500 acres. That's what I want to see again. How are we going to accomplish that? Well, we're a young organization. We're visionary. We're ambitious, possibly overly ambitious. But you know what? We've raised between $3 and $4 million in the past 3 or 4 years. And if you'd asked me in 2016, could we do that? I'd say, hell no, there's not a chance, not even a possibility. But I'm telling you, this story is resonating with people, and it's resonating with some corporations and some philanthropic funders. We need that story to continue to resonate, because through it, here's how we can make a difference. First, we began to really build a volunteer coalition. And last year in 2019, we gained some steam, gained some ground on this, but 2020 has really set us back. We're reassessing, rebuilding, putting in place some infrastructure. And I think 2021, we're going to come back swinging with a volunteer corps. So we've now have registered volunteers from across the Southeast. You can see the number of volunteers per city based on the size of the dot. And the areas that have a yellow dot are cities where we have somebody that said, you know what, I'll raise my hand. I will be a volunteer steward for SGI. And what
for me, what's the minimum size for a functioning prairie ecosystem? And what does the term pocket prairie mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I don't know that there is an easy answer to the minimum size component. I mean, we certainly see that lots of our remnant tallgrass prairies, which are in agricultural landscapes today, are hanging on at 1/8 of an acre or 1/4 of an acre. Is sometimes the largest that we see. Whether they're functioning is an altogether different matter, because obviously certain species like Henslow sparrows need a large enough grassland or they won't come there. So they need one that's on the scale of dozens of acres at least, preferably larger. So they can be there and they can be remnants, but they may not be totally functional when they're at that size. However, they are useful, very useful for certain components of biodiversity. So pocket prairies typically is a term that refers to something that can be anywhere from a few square feet to, you know, maybe a few dozen, a few hundred square feet, be put into the corner of your yard, off of a sidewalk. And I think we've seen from countless examples, like on our campus at Austin Peay, we have a pocket prairie that's 3,000 square feet with 330 native species in it, that it is amazing attractant for pollinators. So every little bit helps, and I would encourage you to definitely continue. I know Wild Ones is definitely big into that concept, and I urge you to continue that.
Okay. Trina, it's not really a question, but she says she's clearing out the trees in her property to try to get the bobwhite quail and milkweed and spitanthes, I guess that's a plant, and other things, local purple fringeless orchid back to her property. So she says she's let it get too shady and she's working on that. So that sounds wonderful. Ken mentions that
one
Lost
thing,
River Cave. Right.
I was just going to say to Trina, one thing you might think about, Trina, is again, location matters, and you know this, I'm sure. I would say if you're in an area where you've got dry oaks, dry site oaks like post oak, blackjack oak, maybe southern red oak, some of those kinds, those are good indicator species. Mockernut hickory or shortleaf pine. Those are good indicators for when, you know, you probably have the right conditions for a savanna. So, you know, if you have any questions about, you know, are the right indicator species there, please reach out. We'll try to help advise on that. But we would not recommend you, for example, to go into an area that should be forest. If you're seeing mostly forest species there, it may not make sense to open it up. So it just depends on your circumstances.
Okay. Ken mentions that Lost River Cave in Bowling Green has an urban prairie. I am not sure how many acres it is. If somebody knows, can you put that in the chat? And many volunteers are working to help keep that maintained. I just wonder, have you been to the one at Bowling Green? Okay.
I don't think I've been to that one. I've been to one small one that the Nature Conservancy has done near the entrance to Mammoth Cave National Park along one of the roads into the park.
Okay. Ben P says he's been planting a few dozen species of native flowers on his tiny property, and he's happy to see a lot of insects, including pollinators. He just began last fall. So, as you said, every little bit helps. And yeah, Barbara asked about removing cedar trees.
Barbara, that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, if you're in areas with an acidic substrate, like over chert or sandstone, you know, post oaks and some of those things are the things to look for. If you're in an area over limestone, and you would expect a lot of cedars. So I would say if you live in southern Kentucky, especially if you live in like the Mammoth Cave Hills area, that line of hills there between Bowling Green and Russellville over to Hopkinsville, much of that, the southern edge of those hills and the southern slopes, the western slopes, probably would have been savanna and open woodland historically with embedded barrens. If you're somewhere like that, you would expect, because of the limestone, that you're going to have a lot of cedar encroachment. Absolutely, cedar removal is a good thing. The exceptions about cedar removal would be these. If you have a cliff community, cedars are important to those, including the cliff top, where you do sometimes get glades. Or in the middle of like a limestone glade or limestone barren, that you may have a cedar there that's hundreds of years old in the middle of the barren, but on the edges of the barren, the outside edge of the glade is where you would get the cedars that you would probably want to remove. Those are the young ones. The ones in the center are probably remaining there because fires can't get into the center of those sometimes. So just be careful about the ones you remove. Those that look really, really old and gnarled, you might want to leave those, remove the rest.
Okay. John has asked, he's in Bowling Green, is there any research on fire destroying invasive plants in meadows? And is there any truth to the barrens in the Glasgow area were caused by Native Americans using fire to foster meadows?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great questions. So one is, yes, there's definitely an abundance of literature on using fire and obviously other kinds of means to treat various invasive species. I am not the best person about the specific strategies of when you would use fire for a particular invasive species. Obviously, some of them, fire can actually increase them, like Sericea lespedeza is a good example. So yes, number one, there's a healthy literature on that, and if you Google some of that, I'm sure you will find some answers. And increasingly, we're going to be moving to have more of those kind of frequently asked questions also on our website. Regarding the Glasgow area, yes, there's an abundance of literature for that river over in the Barron River watershed, which I think is where that is. Because that area was where one of the earliest roads came from Lexington to Nashville, came through that general region. There's an abundance of early documentation going back at least into the probably 1770s or 1780s. There has been a couple of ecologists who have written and speculated, and I think honestly, I'm gonna just be honest, I think it's pure speculation that the Pennyroyal Plain was caused by Native American burning. However, as Reed Noss points out in his book, there are no documented occurrences of Native Americans creating open prairie conditions from a closed forest ecosystem. So the idea that the Pennyroyal Plain was once densely forested, that the Native Americans came in, opened it up with fire, and then it became prairie is not supported by evidence, and is mostly supposition. So what is possible is that it could have been a very open savanna habitat, possibly very open grassy woodland. At that point, I think it is possible to think about it being opened up to something a little bit more expansive. But even still, I think the evidence would suggest that some version of the Pennyroyal Plain Prairie is definitely a natural feature, and that it has been on the landscape for at least several thousand years, if not more.
Okay, thank you. Ben would like to know, is SGI partnering with state and national parks in the Southeast to potentially restore some grassland there?
Great question. Yeah, in fact, one of our biggest government funders in the past 2 years has been the National Park Service. We've got 3 or 4 really exciting grants with them. Right now, most of the work pertains to studying and surveying existing grassland remnants for those parks, and does not necessarily pertain directly toward restoration of National Park Service lands. We hope to have that conversation about how we can do more restoration focused work. And I think the National Park Service so far has been very amenable to having those discussions. So we're really excited. Our newest grant with NPS is for us to develop recommended seed lists for all of the national parks of the Southeast. And that funding will begin in January. So that'll play a prominent role in going forth with our future seed program that SGI is developing.
Donna asks what you think about how the Sandhills region of Georgia and Alabama relate to the more northerly grasslands.
That's a good question. They're a phenomenally cool region. Obviously, Sandhills with longleaf pine. They are essentially an endemic community of the South. I mean, they're unique. They mostly are home to southern species. Very few species there occur in the northern regions of the country. There are a few things, some sedges, for example, that occur in the Northeast that might be in some of the sandhill seepage wetlands and so forth. But by and large, they are a southern community dominated by mostly southern species of plants and animals.
Okay. Richard asks, Tom Kimmerer refers to the grasslands in the bluegrass region as woodland pastures. Does that fit your terminology for savanna or other term?
That's a great question. So the bluegrass is it's actually a very well-researched region. Julian Campbell, if you guys are familiar with Julian, who lives in Lexington, has a website called the Bluegrass Woodland Restoration Center, I think is the name of it. Anyway, some amazing resources he's put together, including lots of great references on the historical conditions of the bluegrass. I think Julian makes an excellent argument in support that the central or inner bluegrass was largely a forested and woodland region, but that the outer bluegrass was primarily the region that was much more open and was savanna. In some cases, it might even had sections, small sections of open, very sparsely treed grasslands. Places like Bootalua Barren State Nature Preserve and the Southern Bluegrass are remnants of that savanna landscape. Now, when the first settlers went into the bluegrass, my understanding is that they began to selectively thin some of the trees and promoted more of that open sort of open woodland feel, maybe more so than what would have been natural. And so that in thinning that forest and woodland a little bit more, and then introducing grasses like Kentucky bluegrass and eventually fescue, that created sort of unnatural savanna-like conditions in the inner bluegrass. So back to the original question, I think that's what Tom Kimmerer refers to as the woodland pastures, which are largely derived from non-grassland communities, more from a forest woodland setting. They look like savannas. They may harbor some species of savannas, but I think the true savannas that we would refer to for the bluegrass region would have been the outer bluegrass, and they are essentially a functionally extinct ecosystem that's represented now by very, very tiny little patches. So I'm not sure they're 100% the same. I think they're similar and related. And I'd like to talk, obviously, with Tom more about that and make sure that, you know, I'm fully understanding his usage. I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Richard has one question. When you restore a degraded area to a prairie, do you do anything to reintroduce the appropriate soil microbes for prairie?
Well, that's one of the most frequently asked questions we get, Richard. And honestly, right now we don't. I'd like to study that more from what they do in the Midwest with some of the techniques. Site selection is obviously very important, and not every site can be restored or maybe should be attempted for restoration. But the soil microbe angle is something that is still, I think, very much a frontier and a very poorly known area that we need, as SGI, we need to have a better understanding on that as we go forward. So thanks for bringing it back to the surface. It's good for us to keep being reminded of that.
I just took a seminar on prairies and stuff from Illinois, and there's a lady there who sells microbes, and she'll ship you, you know, a pound or 20 pounds or whatever. And she said they're gathered from Illinois prairies. So I don't know how applicable they are to a little farther south, but they're local. And I'll look for the contact information and share that later through our chapter. John has a question. Has SGI used pollen in the soil to determine if grasslands were ever part of past environments?
Good question. So we are definitely science driven. Most soils, to my understanding, most soils are not conducive to being able to retain pollen. It degrades under most soil conditions. If you have select wetland sites, some of which we would consider to be wetland grasslands, like certain bog or fen habitats, certain types of depression ponds, excuse me, those do retain pollen for very long periods of time. And of course, for the Tennessee and Kentucky region, that pollen record extends back to roughly 35,000 years ago. In places like Florida, that pollen record extends back to about 75,000 years. So it does allow us to get some glimpses as to what was going on. The unfortunate thing for our region is that some new data suggests that, and for example, in Kentucky, LaRue Pond, or Jackson Pond in LaRue County, is one of the most famous sites for looking at the pollen profile going back into the ice ages. But some new data suggests that the pollen profile, my understanding is that the pollen record from now until about 13,000 years ago is largely unreliable from these wetland pond pollen studies, because there's been so much mixing of sediments in the upper layers of these ponds, natural mixing and mixing by large animals like mastodons and other kinds of large animals in the past 13,000 years. So that's obviously significant because it contradicts what earlier pollen studies, pollinologists had suggested in, say, the 80s and 90s, who were making claims about what kind of changes were happening in the pollen record, say 3,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. And so this new study suggests that we may not be able to trust those records that are more recent than 13,000 years, leaving us hanging in limbo as to how reliable some of those records can be for more recent time periods. So that's a big area of continued research that's needed. And likewise, I'll just end that particular comment with this, that the study of what are called phytoliths, which are the crystals in the leaves of grass cells, it has been used in places like Adams County, Ohio, which those do preserve in the sediments fairly well. So I think phytolith study is something we need to do a lot more of in Kentucky and Tennessee and other places in the South.
Okay, one more question. So if someone has, well, me, started to try to do a prairie patch and I've planted in little blue stem and big blue stem, how far apart should my clumps of grasses be? Because right now all I have is grass.
Good question. Well, I'll tell you, I've learned the hard way on that, planting stuff way too densely. So you're talking about planting with plugs, right?
That's what I started with, yeah.
Yeah,
They've gotten bigger,
and this is like a small patch prairie?
Yes. Yep.
I guess I would answer that by saying a couple things. One is what we typically see, in a natural scenario is that if you go to a natural prairie, you can usually roll a softball between the clumps of native grasses and the various bases of various wildflowers, right? So just imagine a softball or grapefruit, being able to roll it between those, right? That's important because in natural prairies, that allows space at the ground for things like ground nesting birds like bobwhite and other small species to exist. I think minimally you'd want to start there, but it depends. If you're planting with various forbs like asters and goldenrods and whatnot, you may want to make that spacing much more open. I definitely would not go any more dense than that. And then of course, things you guys know much better than I do. The floppiness of a prairie, especially a pocket prairie, sometimes can be unappealing. And I would say the one thing I would just remind folks of is there's so many kinds of southern grasslands that we should definitely not, number one, let's don't fall in the trap of thinking that they were all tall grass. Many of the grasslands we had historically were documented were mid-grass, even short grass in our region. Francois Michaud talks about going across the Pennyroyal Plain, and the grasses were only about knee height at times. So that's one thing. Secondly is that a lot of our grasslands were also types of glades, and so you can incorporate sort of rock gardens into those grassland features really nicely by having barrens or glade type gardens as well. And then finally, what we've been really excited about is big blue stem. Everybody loves big blue stem, right? Except most people don't like it in a garden because it can grow 6 to 8 feet tall and start falling over on you. But in our biodiversity explorations we've done on some of the canyons in Southeast Kentucky, we've actually found that the big blue stem there along the Big South Fork River is probably a new species to science and often grows about half the height of typical big blue stem. So that's a great example where we could actually bring that species, and we brought it into our native garden at the university, and it only is about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, about the typical height of little blue stem. So I think as we get more of those species into cultivation, that's gonna offer a lot more potential for horticulture and the plant trade as well.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you.